The Ganzfeld Experiments, Searching for Evidence of Telepathy. Introduction: Can minds communicate without words? For centuries, people have wondered whether human beings possess abilities that extend beyond the 5 traditional senses. Stories of mothers sensing danger to distant children, identical twins experiencing the same emotions across continents, and people knowing who is calling before answering the phone have persisted throughout history. Most scientists explain these experiences as coincidence, selective memory, or subconscious perception. Others ask a different question. What if there really is a subtle form of communication that science simply hasn't fully understood? In the 1970s, a series of experiments attempted to answer that question under controlled laboratory conditions. These studies became known as the Ganzfeld Experiments. Unlike seances, fortune tellers, or spiritual demonstrations, the Ganzfeld studies were designed to remove distractions, eliminate sensory clues, and test one simple possibility. Can information travel directly from one human mind to another? For decades, these experiments produced some of the most controversial findings in modern parapsychology. Supporters claim they provide statistically significant evidence for telepathy. Critics argue the results disappear under stricter controls. Today, the Ganzfeld experiments remain one of the most debated scientific investigations into psychic phenomena ever conducted. This is the story of how they began, how they worked, what they found, and why scientists continue to argue about them decades later. Part 1: A question that refused to disappear. Throughout history, nearly every civilization has described mysterious moments when information seemed to pass between people without words. Ancient Greek philosophers debated whether thoughts could travel through an unseen medium. Hindu texts spoke of enlightened masters communicating silently across great distances. Buddhist traditions described advanced meditation practitioners who appeared capable of perceiving distant events. Indigenous cultures around the world often accepted telepathic communication as a natural ability that modern society had forgotten. For centuries, however, these stories remained impossible to verify. There was no scientific method capable of testing such claims. Everything began to change during the late 19th century. As psychology emerged as its own scientific discipline, researchers became interested in studying experiences that had traditionally been dismissed as supernatural. Organizations dedicated to investigating psychic phenomena began collecting reports of apparitions, precognitive dreams, and alleged cases of telepathy. Some researchers believed these experiences pointed toward undiscovered aspects of human consciousness. Others suspected that careful investigation would expose nothing more than fraud, coincidence, and wishful thinking. Either outcome would be valuable. If psychic abilities existed, science should be able to detect them. If they did not, science could explain why so many people believed they had experienced them. During the early 20th century, researchers attempted numerous experiments involving card guessing, hidden symbols, and statistical probability. One of the best-known researchers was Dr. J. B. Rhine at Duke University. Using specially designed decks of Zener cards featuring stars, circles, squares, waves, and crosses, Rhine asked participants to identify hidden symbols using only intuition. Some individuals appeared to perform better than chance. Most did not. Although Rhine's work generated enormous public interest, many scientists criticized his methods. Could participants have seen reflections? Were there unconscious cues from experimenters? Were successful results simply statistical flukes? The debate intensified. By the 1960s, psychologists recognized another problem with many telepathy experiments. Everyday life is filled with distractions. People constantly receive visual information, sounds, smells, temperature changes, and countless subtle sensations. Perhaps, if psychic perception existed, these ordinary sensory inputs overwhelmed whatever weak signal the mind might otherwise detect. If so, researchers needed a way to quiet the senses. Instead of increasing stimulation, they would reduce it. This idea eventually led scientists to borrow a technique from perceptual psychology known as the Ganzfeld. The German word Ganzfeld translates roughly as entire field or complete field. It refers to a situation in which the brain receives completely uniform sensory input. Instead of processing changing sights and sounds, the mind experiences a stable, featureless environment. Psychologists had already discovered that such conditions produced unusual mental experiences. People often reported vivid mental imagery. Some experienced dreamlike scenes. Others described hearing voices, seeing flashes of light, or entering deeply relaxed states. Researchers wondered whether this unusual state of consciousness might make telepathic communication easier to detect. It was an intriguing possibility. Rather than asking participants to guess cards in a noisy laboratory, scientists would place them into a carefully controlled environment designed to minimize external distractions. If information could travel directly between minds, perhaps it would become more noticeable when the ordinary senses were temporarily quieted. It was a bold idea, and it would soon become one of the most famous and controversial experiments in the history of parapsychology. Part 2: Building the Perfect Telepathy Test. During the early 1970s, psychologists and parapsychologists began designing a new type of experiment that they believed would address many of the criticisms aimed at earlier psychic research. Their goal was surprisingly simple. If telepathy existed, they wanted to create the fairest possible opportunity for it to occur. The first challenge was eliminating ordinary communication. The sender and the receiver would be placed in completely separate, soundproof rooms. They would have no physical contact, no visual signals, no spoken words, no electronic communication, nothing that could explain the transfer of information through normal means. Next came the receiver. This participant would enter what researchers called the Ganzfeld state. The procedure itself was remarkably simple. The receiver would recline comfortably in a chair. Half of a white ping-pong ball would be placed over each eye, creating a smooth, featureless field of vision. A soft red light illuminated the room, producing an even glow with no distinct shapes or shadows. Headphones played continuous white noise, or sometimes pink noise, masking outside sounds with a steady rushing hiss. Within minutes, many participants reported entering a deeply relaxed, almost dreamlike state. Some described floating sensations. Others experienced vivid colors moving across their visual field. Many reported spontaneous images, symbols, faces, landscapes, or emotional impressions appearing in their minds. Researchers instructed them to describe everything they experienced aloud. Nothing was considered too strange or insignificant. Every thought, image, feeling, color, or sensation was recorded. Meanwhile, in another room, the sender concentrated intensely on a randomly selected target. The target might be a photograph of a mountain landscape, a busy city street, a waterfall, an elephant, a child flying a kite, a famous painting, or even a short video clip in later experiments. The sender studied the target continuously, attempting to mentally transmit every detail to the receiver. Some imagined projecting the image across space. Others visualized the receiver looking through their own eyes. Some simply focused with complete concentration, hoping their thoughts would somehow be received. The session typically lasted around 30 minutes. Throughout that time, the receiver continued describing every impression that entered their awareness. Importantly, neither participant knew what the target would be until the experiment began. Random selection was essential. Without randomness, unconscious bias could influence the results. After the session ended came the critical test. The receiver was shown 4 possible targets. One was the actual image viewed by the sender. The other 3 were decoys selected to be reasonably similar in complexity and style. The receiver's task was simply to decide which of the 4 best matched the mental impressions experienced during the session. If no telepathy existed, random guessing should produce a correct choice about 25% of the time. That number became the benchmark. Anything significantly higher, repeated over many experiments, might suggest that something unusual was occurring. At first glance, the procedure seemed elegant. It removed ordinary sensory communication. It relied on randomization. It generated measurable results. And unlike stories of psychic experiences told after the fact, the Ganzfeld protocol could be repeated again and again under controlled laboratory conditions. For many researchers, it represented the most scientifically rigorous test of telepathy ever devised. The question was no longer how the experiment worked. The real question was whether the results would reveal anything beyond chance. Part 3: The surprising results. When the first Ganzfeld experiments were completed, researchers expected one of two outcomes. Either participants would perform no better than random chance, suggesting there was no evidence of telepathy, or they would occasionally produce impressive results that could be explained away as statistical luck. What happened instead surprised nearly everyone involved. Across multiple experiments, receivers appeared to identify the correct target more often than expected by chance. Remember, random guessing among 4 possible targets should produce a success rate of approximately 25%. Some of the earliest Ganzfeld studies reported hit rates closer to 35%. At first glance, a 10% increase might not seem extraordinary. But in statistics, even relatively small differences can become highly significant when they occur consistently across many trials. Researchers began repeating the experiments at different laboratories. Some reported similar findings. Participants often described surprisingly accurate impressions. A receiver might report seeing waves crashing against rocks while the sender concentrated on a photograph of the ocean. Another described a large bird soaring through the sky, later discovering the target image featured an eagle in flight. Sometimes the similarities seemed remarkably specific. Other times they were more symbolic than literal. Researchers noticed another interesting pattern. Certain individuals consistently performed better than others. Creative people, artists, musicians, meditators, and individuals who believed telepathy might be possible often achieved higher success rates. Participants who were skeptical or anxious frequently performed no better than chance. Some scientists wondered whether relaxation, openness, or personality influenced performance. Others believed these apparent differences simply reflected random variation. Relationships also appeared to matter. Close friends, married couples, siblings, parents and children. Several studies suggested that emotionally connected pairs sometimes achieved higher hit rates than strangers. This observation echoed countless anecdotal stories from everyday life. Many people had experienced thinking about someone moments before receiving a phone call from them. Others reported sensing when a loved one was in danger despite being hundreds of miles away. The Ganzfeld experiment seemed, at least to some researchers, to provide a laboratory setting where such experiences might be measurable. As more data accumulated, researchers combined results from numerous studies using a statistical technique known as a meta-analysis. Rather than focusing on individual experiments, which could succeed or fail for many reasons, a meta-analysis examined the overall pattern. Several analyses suggested that the combined results remained above the level expected by chance. To supporters, this was exciting. No single experiment needed to prove telepathy. Instead, they argued that the combined evidence pointed toward a small but genuine effect that appeared repeatedly under controlled conditions. Some scientists described it as a weak signal hidden within statistical noise. Others compared it to early discoveries in medicine or physics, where subtle effects became clear only after many experiments were combined. News of the findings spread beyond academic journals. Television documentaries featured the Ganzfeld experiments. Popular magazines ran articles asking whether science had finally found evidence for psychic communication. Public fascination grew rapidly. For believers, the experiments represented the strongest scientific support yet for telepathy. But not everyone was convinced. In fact, the more attention the Ganzfeld results received, the more intensely they were scrutinized. Many scientists argued that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. If telepathy truly existed, even a small methodological flaw could produce misleading results. The debate was only beginning. What followed would become one of the most heated scientific controversies in modern psychology, as skeptics and supporters battled over every detail of the Ganzfeld experiments, each convinced the evidence was on their side. Part 4: The critics push back. As news of the Ganzfeld experiments spread, many scientists acknowledged that the results were intriguing. But intrigue was not enough. In science, extraordinary claims require exceptionally rigorous evidence. If human beings could truly communicate through thought alone, the discovery would transform psychology, neuroscience, and perhaps even our understanding of consciousness itself. Such a revolutionary claim demanded careful scrutiny. Critics began examining every aspect of the Ganzfeld protocol, searching for possible weaknesses that might explain the results without invoking telepathy. One of the first concerns involved sensory leakage. Even tiny, unintentional cues could influence an experiment. Were the rooms completely soundproof? Could faint noises travel through ventilation systems? Did experimenters accidentally reveal clues through their tone of voice or facial expressions? Could the receiver somehow infer information from subtle details that no one had intended to communicate? Researchers responded by tightening their procedures. Additional soundproofing was installed. Experimenters who interacted with the receiver were often kept unaware of the target image, preventing them from unconsciously influencing the participant. This approach, known as a double-blind procedure, ensured that neither the receiver nor the experimenter knew the correct answer during the session. Another criticism focused on randomization. If the 4 target images were not selected carefully, one image might naturally stand out from the others. A bright tropical beach among 3 dull indoor scenes, for example, would be easier to identify even without telepathy. To address this, later studies used computer-generated randomization and carefully matched target sets of similar complexity, brightness, and emotional tone. Statisticians also became involved. They examined whether researchers had unintentionally introduced bias when selecting which experiments to publish. This concern became known as the file drawer problem. Imagine that 20 laboratories conduct Ganzfeld experiments. Suppose 5 produce positive results while 15 find nothing unusual. If only the successful studies are published, the scientific literature gives a misleading impression that telepathy has been consistently demonstrated. Meta-analyses could therefore exaggerate the true effect. Supporters argued that they had accounted for publication bias and that the positive findings remained statistically significant. Critics disagreed, claiming the evidence became much weaker once unpublished or poorly controlled studies were considered. Then came the replication debate. In science, one successful experiment means very little unless other researchers can reproduce the same results independently. Some laboratories reported success with the Ganzfeld method. Others failed to find any evidence of telepathy at all. The inconsistency puzzled everyone. Supporters suggested that telepathy, if real, might be influenced by factors that were difficult to control, such as participant motivation, emotional connection, belief, stress, or even the atmosphere of the laboratory itself. Skeptics countered that genuine natural phenomena should not depend on belief or ideal conditions. Gravity works whether someone believes in it or not. Electricity behaves consistently in laboratories around the world. If telepathy were a real physical process, critics argued, its effects should be equally reliable. The debate became increasingly technical. Researchers argued over statistical methods, experimental design, equipment, participant selection, and data analysis. Entire academic papers were devoted to discussing details that seemed almost invisible to the general public. Yet those details mattered enormously. A single overlooked source of bias could produce results that appeared meaningful but were actually the product of chance or flawed methodology. Despite decades of criticism and repeated refinements, the Ganzfeld experiments refused to disappear. Some studies continued to report positive outcomes. Others did not. Neither side could claim complete victory. Believers saw a persistent statistical signal that hinted at an unexplained human ability. Skeptics saw a field struggling with inconsistent results and methodological challenges. The controversy ensured that the Ganzfeld experiments remained one of the most closely examined and fiercely debated areas of parapsychological research. Rather than settling the question of telepathy, the experiments had opened an even larger discussion. How should science investigate phenomena that appear to exist only at the very edge of what can be measured? Part 5: Famous Researchers and the Battle of Ideas. As the Ganzfeld experiments gained international attention, several researchers became closely associated with the field. Some believed they were uncovering genuine evidence of telepathy. Others devoted their careers to testing those claims as rigorously as possible. The debate became one of the longest-running scientific disagreements in modern psychology. Among the most influential figures was psychologist Charles Honorton. Working primarily at the Psychophysical Research Laboratories in Princeton, New Jersey, Honorton believed that previous telepathy experiments had been criticized fairly, and he wanted to design protocols that addressed every legitimate concern. He became one of the strongest advocates for the Ganzfeld method. Honorton emphasized strict controls, random target selection, careful documentation, and improved laboratory procedures. His goal was not simply to prove telepathy. He wanted experiments that both believers and skeptics could accept as scientifically credible. On the opposite side of the debate stood psychologist Ray Hyman. Hyman was not opposed to investigating psychic claims. In fact, he argued that they should be tested. But he believed extraordinary conclusions required extraordinarily careful methodology. Throughout the 1980s, Hyman carefully reviewed published Ganzfeld studies. He identified possible weaknesses involving statistical analysis, sensory leakage, participant selection, and experimental controls. Many supporters initially viewed his criticisms as attempts to dismiss psychic research altogether. Yet something unusual happened. Instead of ignoring one another, Honorton and Hyman began discussing the evidence directly. After years of debate, the two researchers reached an uncommon agreement. Rather than continuing to argue publicly, they jointly published a paper outlining both the strengths and weaknesses of existing Ganzfeld research. More importantly, they agreed on a new set of standards for future experiments. These recommendations became known as the Ganzfeld protocols. The newer experiments relied heavily on computers. Target selection became fully automated. Randomization was computerized. Experimenter involvement during critical stages was reduced as much as possible. Automation minimized opportunities for unconscious human influence. The Ganzfeld studies produced fresh results. Once again, researchers reported hit rates above chance. Supporters celebrated the findings as evidence that improved controls had not eliminated the apparent effect. Critics remained cautious. Some acknowledged that the newer protocols were much stronger than earlier versions. Others argued that statistical significance alone did not establish the existence of telepathy. Meanwhile, additional researchers entered the field. Psychologist Dean Radin became one of the best-known advocates for psi research, publishing analyses suggesting that numerous experiments, including Ganzfeld studies, collectively supported the existence of anomalous information transfer. Other scientists, however, remained unconvinced. Some argued that psychology itself was experiencing a broader replication crisis. Many effects once considered reliable had become difficult to reproduce when larger, more rigorous studies were performed. Could Ganzfeld results simply reflect the same problem? The disagreement extended far beyond statistics. At its heart lay a philosophical question. What counts as convincing evidence? Supporters argued that science often accepts subtle effects supported by many independent studies. Few experiments are perfect. Knowledge advances by accumulating evidence over time. Skeptics countered that claims challenging established scientific understanding require evidence far stronger than what had been presented. The burden of proof, they argued, remained exceptionally high. Despite decades of discussion, neither side completely persuaded the other. Yet the respectful collaboration between Honorton and Hyman remains one of the most remarkable aspects of the Ganzfeld story. Instead of treating one another as enemies, they demonstrated that scientists with opposing views could work together to improve experimental design. Their collaboration is often cited as a model of scientific disagreement carried out with professionalism rather than hostility. Today, the names Charles Honorton and Ray Hyman remain inseparable from the history of the Ganzfeld experiments. Whether one believes the studies revealed evidence of telepathy or simply highlighted the challenges of investigating extraordinary claims, their work fundamentally shaped how parapsychological research is conducted. The question, however, remains unresolved. If the experiments have never produced universal scientific agreement, why do researchers continue studying them? The answer may lie in a mystery even larger than telepathy itself, the enduring puzzle of human consciousness. Part 6. What do the Ganzfeld experiments really tell us? More than 50 years after the first Ganzfeld experiments, the debate remains remarkably alive. No major scientific organization has declared that telepathy has been proven. At the same time, no explanation has completely satisfied everyone who has studied the data. The Ganzfeld experiments occupy a unique place in scientific history. They are neither universally accepted nor completely dismissed. Instead, they remain suspended in a fascinating gray area. Supporters point to the overall body of evidence. Across decades of research, thousands of individual trials have been conducted in laboratories around the world. Several meta-analyses have concluded that participants performed slightly, but consistently, better than chance. The effect is small. It is not dramatic. No one is reading entire books with their mind or holding conversations without speaking. If the phenomenon is real, it appears to be subtle, inconsistent, and influenced by conditions that scientists do not yet fully understand. Some researchers compare it to trying to hear a whisper during a thunderstorm. The signal, if it exists, may be extremely weak. Others speculate that telepathy may not be a signal at all. Instead, they suggest that consciousness itself may be connected in ways that current neuroscience has yet to explain. Ideas from quantum physics are sometimes mentioned in these discussions. However, most physicists caution that there is currently no accepted evidence linking quantum mechanics to telepathy or psychic communication. While the language of quantum theory is often used in popular books and documentaries, the connection remains speculative rather than scientifically established. Skeptics maintain a different perspective. They argue that decades of research should have produced much stronger evidence if telepathy were a genuine human ability. Science routinely confirms new discoveries through repeated, reliable experiments. Water boils at predictable temperatures. Chemical reactions can be reproduced in laboratories worldwide. The laws of physics do not depend on belief, expectation, or emotional connection. The Ganzfeld effect, by contrast, appears inconsistent. Some laboratories report positive findings. Others report none. Some participants seem unusually successful. Most perform close to chance. From the skeptical viewpoint, this inconsistency suggests that ordinary psychological factors, subtle biases, statistical fluctuations, or experimental limitations remain more likely explanations than an unknown form of mind-to-mind communication. Yet even critics often acknowledge one important achievement. The Ganzfeld experiments significantly improved the scientific study of extraordinary claims. Researchers developed stronger blind procedures, more sophisticated randomization methods, better statistical analyses, greater transparency, independent replication efforts. Many of these improvements influenced psychological research far beyond parapsychology itself. Perhaps the greatest contribution of the Ganzfeld experiments is not whether they prove telepathy. It is that they demonstrated difficult questions can be investigated using scientific methods rather than relying solely on belief or disbelief. Instead of asking people simply to accept extraordinary stories, researchers attempted to test them under controlled conditions. That approach reflects the very heart of science. Curiosity combined with skepticism. Open-mindedness balanced by careful evidence. Today, advances in neuroscience, brain imaging, artificial intelligence, and cognitive psychology continue to deepen our understanding of how the human mind works. Whether these technologies will eventually explain the Ganzfeld findings or reveal entirely new aspects of consciousness remains unknown. The experiments continue to inspire researchers because they touch one of humanity's oldest questions. Are our minds truly separate? Or is there a level of consciousness that connects us in ways we have only begun to explore? The answer has yet to emerge. But the search itself has become one of the most intriguing chapters in the scientific exploration of the human mind. As with many enduring mysteries, the Ganzfeld experiments remind us that the boundary between the known and the unknown is often where the most fascinating discoveries begin. Conclusion: an open question. The Ganzfeld experiments have now been discussed, repeated, criticized, and refined for more than half a century. Few areas of research have generated so much interest while remaining so unresolved. For believers, the studies offer some of the strongest laboratory evidence that telepathy, or at least some form of anomalous information transfer, may exist. The results, they argue, are too consistent across decades to dismiss as mere coincidence. For skeptics, the same body of research tells a different story. They point to inconsistent replication, small statistical effects, possible methodological weaknesses, and the absence of a widely accepted mechanism that could explain how thoughts might travel from one mind to another. Both sides agree on one important point. The Ganzfeld experiments represent one of the most carefully designed attempts ever made to test claims of psychic communication under controlled scientific conditions. Unlike stories passed down through folklore or dramatic television demonstrations, these experiments sought measurable evidence that could be analyzed, repeated, and challenged. Whether they ultimately revealed telepathy or simply highlighted the extraordinary complexity of human perception remains an open question. Perhaps future technologies will provide answers. Brain imaging continues to reveal astonishing details about neural activity. Artificial intelligence is uncovering patterns in data that humans often overlook. New theories of consciousness are being explored by neuroscientists, psychologists, and philosophers alike. It is possible that future discoveries will explain the Ganzfeld results through entirely conventional processes. It is equally possible that they will uncover aspects of consciousness that today's science has yet to recognize. History reminds us that many ideas once considered impossible later became accepted scientific facts. History also reminds us that many extraordinary claims failed when subjected to rigorous testing. The challenge is knowing which is which. That is why the Ganzfeld experiments continue to fascinate researchers. They sit precisely at the intersection of curiosity and skepticism. They encourage us to question our assumptions while demanding evidence strong enough to change our minds. Regardless of where one stands in the debate, the experiments have left an undeniable legacy. They challenged researchers to improve scientific methods. They encouraged respectful dialogue between opposing viewpoints. And they inspired generations of scientists to investigate one of humanity's oldest mysteries with careful observation rather than unquestioning belief. Can thoughts travel directly from one mind to another? The Ganzfeld experiments have not provided a final answer. But they have ensured that the question remains one of the most compelling and controversial in the study of human consciousness. Perhaps one day the mystery will be solved. Until then, the Ganzfeld experiments stand as a reminder that science is not only about finding answers. It is also about having the courage to ask difficult questions, to test them honestly, and to follow the evidence wherever it may lead.